After weeks of triple-digit heat baking the desert southwest, with highs reaching the mid-110s in Phoenix and Palm Springs and the low 110s in Las Vegas, the pattern is finally breaking. But the maps replacing that heat aren't turning green with relief. They're turning deep red with flash flood watches and warnings stretching from Arizona through New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Texas as the annual North American monsoon finally arrives across a landscape that's spent months baking under extreme drought. Meteorologists describe this as a major shift in the region's weather pattern, one that offers relief from weeks of extreme heat while simultaneously introducing an entirely different set of severe risks. Stick around, because the transition from heat to monsoon isn't the relief it sounds like on paper, and understanding exactly why explains what's coming for millions of people this week. Let's start with what's normal about this transition, since the monsoon itself isn't the anomaly here. Every summer, the desert southwest goes through this exact seasonal shift as a large area of high pressure gradually moves and alters the region's wind direction, pulling deep tropical moisture up from Mexico and the Gulf of California into the interior west. That moisture fuels the thunderstorms that define monsoon season, and in a typical year, this transition genuinely does bring welcome relief after a long, dry, scorching stretch. So on its own, heat giving way to monsoon storms is completely expected summer behavior, not a sign that anything unusual is happening. This heat dome itself had already been unusually intense even by regional standards, with temperatures across much of the interior. West climbing 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit above the historical average and surpassing the season-high marks that had already been set during earlier spring heat waves. As that dome aged and began shifting north and east toward the north-central part of the country, it left behind exactly the kind of atmospheric opening the monsoon needed to finally establish itself over the desert basins below. Here's the mechanism behind exactly how this handoff works. As the heat dome that's been sitting over the western U.S. ages and begins shifting north and east, it opens the door for the monsoon's characteristic wind reversal to take hold underneath it. Once that reversal sets in, moisture-rich air gets drawn northward into the desert basins, and the intense daytime heating of the desert surface itself helps trigger the explosive thunderstorm development that monsoon season is known for. It's essentially the same heat that made the region miserable for weeks, now getting redirected into fuel for a completely different kind of hazard. Now here's what's different about this particular transition, and it's the reason forecasters are using much more cautious language than a simple "relief is coming" framing. Most of the Southwest is currently sitting in at least moderate to severe drought, according to meteorologists tracking the region, which means the ground itself is in an unusually poor position to handle the incoming rain safely. Dry, compacted soil doesn't absorb water the way healthier, more saturated ground does, which means even a normal monsoon storm has a higher chance of producing dangerous runoff and flash flooding than it would in a wetter year. One AccuWeather meteorologist tracking the pattern put it plainly, noting that while the rain will genuinely be beneficial for many areas dealing with ongoing drought, the same lightning accompanying those storms could just as easily spark new wildfires across the parched landscape. That single sentence captures the core tension driving this entire story. The same storms delivering desperately needed moisture in one location can simultaneously ignite a dangerous new fire somewhere nearby. The first major risk layer building on top of that dry ground is the threat of dry lightning, meaning lightning strikes that occur with little or no accompanying rainfall reaching the surface. Because so much vegetation across the region has been parched by the preceding heat wave and ongoing drought, a single dry lightning strike can easily ignite new wildfires in exactly the conditions most primed to let them spread quickly. Meteorologists specifically flagged this as one of the most serious near-term concerns as the first wave of monsoon storms arrives, since the drought that made the rain necessary is the same drought that makes the accompanying lightning so dangerous. The second risk layer comes from the storm's own internal structure. Powerful monsoon thunderstorms can produce intense downdrafts strong enough to trigger hayboobs, the large, fast-moving dust storms that can dramatically reduce visibility on desert highways within minutes. Forecasters have specifically warned that some of the strongest storms in this pattern could generate straight-line winds reaching up to 60 miles per hour, capable of downing trees, damaging structures and creating hazardous driving conditions well beyond the rainfall itself. The third and most immediately dangerous layer is flash flooding. And this is where the deep red on the map becomes a literal life safety warning rather than just a color on a forecast graphic. Meteorologists have identified Arizona and western New Mexico as carrying the greatest near-term risk, with the potential for several inches of rain to fall in, concentrated bursts over just the next week. In a region full of dry washes, arroyos, and canyons that can look completely harmless one moment and become raging channels of water within minutes, that kind of rainfall intensity is exactly the setup responsible for some of the most dangerous flash flooding events in the American Southwest history. The same underlying pattern, monsoon moisture streaming north into the interior west, has already produced significant flooding elsewhere along the broader corridor, even before this specific wave of storms arrived. Rescue crews in one southeastern state airlifted more than 200 people from a children's camp after 6 to 12 inches of rain fell in a matter of hours, a stark illustration of just how quickly a heavy rain event tied to the same general moisture pattern can turn into a large-scale emergency operation. There's a sobering historical comparison worth making here, because it shows exactly how quickly a beneficial rain event can turn catastrophic in this part of the country. The deadly July 2024 floods in Texas Hill Country, an area not far from where some of this week's heaviest rain is also expected to fall, demonstrated how a relatively localized, intense rainfall event can overwhelm a landscape and claim lives within a matter of hours. That tragedy remains a defining reference point for meteorologists warning about flash flood risk in similar terrain today, and it's part of why forecasters are treating this monsoon transition with real caution, rather than simply welcoming it as drought relief. Metropolitan areas including Houston and San Antonio could also feel some downstream impacts from this same broader moisture pattern, even though the most concentrated rainfall risk remains focused on the more rugged terrain further west. Here's the genuinely important nuance in this whole story, and it's worth stating clearly, rather than glossing over. The rain itself is not the villain here. Much of the Southwest desperately needs this moisture, and in many communities, this monsoon activity will provide meaningful needed relief from a punishing multi-month drought. The risk isn't that it's raining, it's that the specific combination of parched ground, built-up dry fuel, and locally intense rainfall rates creates hazards on both ends of the spectrum simultaneously: fire risk in the driest pockets and flood risk in the areas that get hit hardest by individual storm cells. If breakdowns like this, tracking exactly how one weather extreme transitions into the next kind of danger, are useful to you, like and subscribe, because this channel covers exactly this kind of fast-moving seasonal transition as it develops. So here's the actual range of outcomes as this plays out over the coming days. In the most beneficial scenario, monsoon storms arrive with steady, more widespread rainfall that meaningfully eases drought conditions, without producing significant flash flooding or fire ignition, which is exactly what much of the region needs and what happens in a typical well-behaved monsoon season. In the more dangerous scenario, isolated but intense storm cells produce dry lightning over already parched vegetation in one area while dumping several inches of rain in a short window somewhere else, creating simultaneous new wildfire starts and dangerous flash flooding within the same regional weather event. Forecasters are explicit that this second scenario is a real active concern this week, not simply a worst-case hypothetical being mentioned for the sake of caution. None of this means the monsoon arrival itself is bad news, and framing it that way would miss the point entirely. What it means is that the transition deserves the same level of attention and preparation that the preceding heat wave did, rather than being treated as an automatic all clear simply because temperatures are finally coming down. So here's what's actually useful for you to do if you're anywhere across Arizona new, Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, or Texas this week. Know your specific flash flood risk before the storms arrive, particularly if you live near or regularly travel through washes, arroyos, canyons, or low water crossings, since these areas can transform from bone dry to dangerously flooded within minutes during a heavy monsoon burst. Never attempt to drive through a flooded roadway, even one that looks shallow, since fast-moving water can sweep a vehicle away far more easily than most people expect. If you're in an area under any kind of red flag warning or dry lightning advisory, treat that as seriously as a heat warning was just days ago, since new wildfire starts during this transition period can spread rapidly through drought-stressed vegetation that hasn't had a chance to recover yet. Have a go bag and evacuation plan ready if you live in a higher wildfire risk area, and know your local fire department's evacuation notification system so you're not caught off guard by a fast-moving ignition. This concern isn't hypothetical either, since reduced funding and staffing at agencies responsible for fire response and land management in some western states has already been raised as a factor that could slow initial attack on any new fires that do start during this transition period. For anyone driving through the region, especially on desert highways, be alert for sudden dust storms that can reduce visibility to near zero within seconds. If you encounter a haboob while driving, the safest response is to pull as far off the roadway as possible, turn off your lights, take your foot off the brake, and wait for visibility to improve, since brake lights can actually cause other drivers to follow you directly into the dust cloud and increase the risk of a pileup. These same dust storms can also bring damaging, straight-line winds strong enough to down trees and power lines, so treating any approaching wall of dust as a serious hazard rather than simply a visibility nuisance is worth keeping in mind. Here's the honest summary of where this transition stands right now. Weeks of dangerous, record-challenging heat across The Southwest are finally giving way to the arrival of the North American Monsoon, but the drought-parched ground underneath that incoming moisture means this transition carries real dry lightning wildfire risk and dangerous flash flood potential rather than simple, uncomplicated relief. Arizona and western New Mexico currently carry the highest near-term risk for the heaviest rainfall, while the broader region remains vulnerable to both new fire ignitions and sudden dust storms, as the pattern fully establishes itself over the coming days. This same pattern is expected to keep evolving over the next several weeks, since monsoon season in this part of the country typically continues producing waves of storm activity well into September, meaning this particular round is likely just the opening chapter rather than a single isolated event. If clear, practical breakdowns like this help you actually understand what's coming instead of just reacting to another weather headline, subscribe so you don't miss the update as this monsoon pattern continues developing. Stay safe, stay weather aware, and I'll be back the moment there's real movement in this forecast.